In the early 13th century, a single man from the remote grasslands of Mongolia reshaped the world more profoundly than nearly any other figure in history. His empire stretched farther than that of Rome or Alexander. He left no grand palaces, wrote no books, and ruled over cities he often never visited. Yet his name still echoes through time: Genghis Khan. How did a child born into obscurity and hardship rise to command the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen? What kind of leadership, vision, and sheer force of will allowed him to unite warring tribes, conquer powerful dynasties, and forge an entirely new model of empire? This is the entire story of Genghis Khan. Let's begin. Before the rise of Temüjin, who would later be known as Genghis Khan, the Mongolian steppe was a vast, wind-swept land divided by blood and bound by tradition. Covering thousands of miles of harsh grassland from the Altai Mountains to the plains of Manchuria, the region was home to a patchwork of nomadic tribes. These groups lived in close contact with nature, relying on their herds of sheep, horses, goats, and cattle for food, clothing, and mobility. They moved with the seasons, carried their homes in carts, and followed the rhythms of the land. But this simple life was shadowed by constant warfare, shifting alliances, and long-standing rivalries. By the middle of the 12th century, the eastern steppe was fractured among dozens of clans and confederations. The largest and most powerful groups included the Karaite, the Naiman, the Tatars, the Merkits, and the Mongols. Despite occasional cooperation, these groups often viewed each other with suspicion or outright hostility. Raiding and revenge were part of everyday life. Power was decentralized, and loyalty was owed first to the clan, then to the Khan, or leader of the tribe. There was no unified Mongol identity at this time. The word Mongol itself referred to only one of many tribes. Kinship and ancestry shaped each tribe's sense of belonging, and competition for resources fueled endless conflict. These tribes did not build cities or states. They had no written laws, no common currency, and no unified religion. Yet they were skilled horsemen, expert archers, and formidable warriors. The environment they lived in required resilience, toughness, and the ability to adapt quickly. To the south of the steppe, the Chinese world was ruled by several dynasties that saw the nomads as both a threat and a resource. The Jin Dynasty, based in northern China, controlled territory once ruled by the Khitan Liao. They dealt frequently with the steppe tribes, sometimes offering trade and titles, sometimes launching military campaigns to suppress them. The Tanguts of the Western Saya, another Chinese dynasty, ruled lands in the northwest and often played a balancing role between the steppe tribes and their southern neighbors. The Jin and Western Xia rulers used diplomacy, trade, and military alliances to try to keep the steppe under control. They would support one tribal Khan over another, hoping to maintain a balance of power. At times, they hired steppe warriors as mercenaries or border guards. In return, steppe leaders sought Chinese recognition and rewards, including silk, grain, and military rank. This system of managed fragmentation helped prevent any one tribe from growing too powerful, but it also created resentment, instability, and a desire for independence among many of the tribes. One of the most feared and despised groups during this time was the Tatars. In the mid-12th century, the Jin Dynasty encouraged the Tatars to attack rival Mongol clans. In return, the Tatars received support and recognition from the Jin court. This sowed deep divisions and long-lasting animosity. Mongol clans, especially the Borjigin and Taichi Ud, suffered under these arrangements and viewed the Jin dynasty's interference as a constant humiliation. The structure of steppe society was based on clans and lineages. Tribal councils, called kurultai, allowed leaders to gather and make decisions, but real power rested with those who could command loyalty through gifts, charisma, and force. A successful Khan was one who could feed his people, protect them, and reward loyalty. If he failed, he could be challenged or overthrown by another rising leader. Unlike many sedentary states, power in the steppe was not inherited by default. It had to be earned. Religion on the steppe was varied and flexible, Shamanism played a central role, with spiritual leaders called shamans acting as mediators between the human and spirit worlds. People believed in the power of nature, the importance of ancestral spirits, and the existence of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a supreme deity who governed the fate of all living things. This belief in fate and divine will would later be a major part of Genghis Khan's legitimacy. Women in steppe societies had more influence than in many neighboring cultures. While men led in war and politics, women managed the camp, livestock, and household economy. They could also advise leaders and even participate in diplomacy. This balance of roles made steppe societies adaptable and resilient. The Mongol tribe itself was not considered powerful at this time. Scattered across the Onon and Kurlan rivers in what is now northeastern Mongolia, the Mongols were just one of many groups competing for survival. They were divided among several clans, including the Borjigin, from which Temüjin would be born. Though not poor in spirit or skill, the Mongols were politically weak and frequently attacked by more powerful neighbors like the Tatars and Merkits. Into this landscape of endless motion, shifting loyalties, and constant warfare, Temüjin was born sometime around the year 1162. Though his birth would later be shrouded in legend, the historical realities of his early life were shaped not by destiny, but by hardship and uncertainty. He was born into the Borjigin clan, a noble yet politically weak lineage within the broader Mongol tribal network. His father, Yesugei, was a chieftain of some influence, but did not hold widespread power. His mother, Holun, came from the Ulkunut tribe and had been taken as a bride by Yesugei after being abducted from another man. According to the traditional Mongol view, lineage and ancestry determined both status and potential. The Borjigin traced their ancestry to Bodonchar Munkag, a semi-legendary figure believed to be the founder of the clan. This lineage provided a sense of noble blood, but in the fragmented steppe world, it held little practical weight without the power to back it. Still, Temüjin's descent from Bodonchar would later be used to strengthen his claim to leadership, especially as he gathered support from rival clans. Temüjin's name itself carried a story. It is said that Yesugei named him after a Tatar warrior he had just captured, Temüjin. While the precise reasoning is unclear, the act may have symbolized triumph over an enemy or simply reflected the customs of the time. Names in Mongol culture often had associations with iron and strength, and Temüjin would later be associated with forging unity and power, much like iron is forged in fire. Though Temüjin was born into a clan of warriors, his early childhood was not one of luxury or security. His father, Yesugei, was a competent but politically vulnerable leader. His influence came primarily from personal alliances rather than tribal dominance. At the time of Temüjin's birth, Yesugei was allied with Togrul, the leader of the Kherate tribe, one of the more powerful confederations in the region. This alliance would play a crucial role in Temüjin's later efforts to build power, but at the time it provided only limited protection. The world Temüjin entered was governed by fragile alliances, fierce rivalries, and the constant threat of betrayal. His family lived a nomadic life, moving with their herds, pitching felt yurts, and trading with neighboring groups. Survival required vigilance, cooperation, and military readiness. Children, even from a young age, were trained in horseback riding, archery, and hunting. Temüjin likely began riding horses by the time he could walk and learned the essentials of life on the steppe from his parents and older siblings. A pivotal moment came when Temüjin was around the age of 9. Following Mongol custom, his father arranged for him to be betrothed to a young girl named Borta from the Conquerad tribe. Marriage was a political tool on the steppe, and Yesugei's aim was to strengthen ties with a powerful and respected clan. He left Temüjin with Borta's family, as was tradition, so that the boy could live among his future in-laws and foster the alliance. On his return journey, however, Yesugei was poisoned by the Tatars, a tribe with whom he had long-standing enmity. The Tatars had previously been supported by the Jin Dynasty to undermine Mongol power, and Yesugei's death may have been part of a broader strategy to weaken rising leaders on the steppe. His poisoning was not immediate, but slow and fatal. He managed to return to his camp before dying from the effects. Yesugei's death marked a turning point. With no strong leader, his family quickly lost their position and protection. The other members of the Mongol tribe refused to recognize Holun's authority or Temüjin's right to inherit leadership. As a result, they cast the family out, forcing them into isolation and poverty. Holun, now widowed, was left to raise her children alone in the harsh landscape. This moment, occurring when Temüjin was still a child, would shape the course of his life and his understanding of loyalty, power, and resilience. The years that followed were defined by struggle. Temüjin, his mother, and his siblings survived by foraging, fishing, and hunting small game. They had few animals and no allies. In Mongol society, a family without a male protector was extremely vulnerable. Holun, however, proved to be a formidable figure, resourceful, intelligent, and fiercely protective. She instilled in her children a strong sense of identity and purpose. Her ability to maintain the family's cohesion during these desperate times left a lasting impression on Temüjin. During this period, internal tensions arose within the family itself. Temüjin's half-brother Begter, born from another of Yesugei's wives, attempted to assert dominance over the group. In a dramatic and deeply revealing episode, Temüjin, with the help of his full brother Khwarazm, killed Begter in a dispute over authority and resources. This act, though violent, reflected the brutal logic of steppe survival and marked Temüjin as someone willing to do whatever was necessary to protect his position. Despite their isolation, Temüjin began to form bonds with other youths from neighboring families. He befriended Boorchu and Jelme, two young men who would later become lifelong companions and key commanders. These friendships, based not on family ties, but mutual loyalty and respect, laid the groundwork for Temüjin's future leadership model, one that valued merit over birth. It was also during this time that Temüjin began to understand the importance of alliances and the dangers of tribal politics. He was briefly captured by the Taichiud, a rival clan with long-standing tensions with the Borjigin. Temüjin was imprisoned in a wooden collar and held in their camp. However, with the help of a sympathetic guard, he escaped. This episode became an important moment in his early legend. More importantly, it demonstrated his ability to inspire loyalty and his determination to resist submission. Temüjin's adolescence was marked by constant challenges, hunger, betrayal, and the threat of violence. Yet, through these trials, he developed the qualities that would later define him as a leader: resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to win and maintain loyalty. He had no inherited army, no kingdom, and no wealth. What he had was a growing understanding of how to navigate the volatile world of the steppe and a vision of unity that most others could not yet imagine. As Temüjin emerged from the hardships of his youth, he began to form the personal relationships and early alliances that would shape his path to power. Though still a young man without formal tribal authority, his charisma, sense of justice, and strategic mind attracted the loyalty of those who had seen his resilience firsthand. But it was not through brute force or inherited title that Temüjin began his rise. It was through forging bonds of trust, especially with individuals outside his immediate clan. Among these early companions, one name would stand out above the rest: Jamuka. Jamuka was also born into the Mongol world, from the Jadaran clan, which, like Temüjin's Borjigin, was part of the wider Mongol tribal network. Unlike Temüjin, however, Jamuka came from a background of greater prestige and more direct aristocratic connections. The two met in their youth and quickly formed a deep friendship. By the customs of the steppe, they became anda, a term signifying a sworn bond of brotherhood that was considered sacred and lifelong. The Anda relationship between Temüjin and Jamuka is one of the most significant personal dynamics in early Mongol history. It reflected the cultural emphasis on loyalty between individuals beyond blood ties. Being Anda meant sharing hardships, honoring each other's lives, and standing together in both peace and war. For a time, their partnership was genuine, and their dreams for the future may have seemed aligned. But the steppe was not a place for shared rule. and their differences in leadership vision would soon drive them apart. During this period, Temüjin's influence slowly expanded. He began to attract followers from different clans, especially those who were disillusioned with the traditional tribal hierarchies. Many of these supporters were of low status, servants, shepherds, or younger sons without inheritance. Yet, Temüjin valued them for their loyalty and ability. He made a point of rewarding service and competence rather than lineage. This was a radical approach in a society where rank and blood often determined one's worth. Temüjin's meritocratic values stood in contrast to the entrenched aristocracy, including Jamuka, who followed the old norms of steppe politics. Jamuka, though charismatic and popular among many traditional nobles, represented the existing power structure. He believed in maintaining the status of the Mongol elite, ruling through established kinship networks, and preserving the old tribal divisions. Despite their growing differences, the bond between Temüjin and Jamuka held for a time. They campaigned together against rival tribes, shared spoils, and earned reputations as capable young leaders. One of the first key moments that tested Temüjin's independent leadership came when he married Borta, fulfilling the betrothal arranged by his father years earlier. With Borta's clan, the Conquests, Temüjin now had the backing of a powerful ally. The marriage was more than personal, it was political, and it strengthened his standing among other tribes. With Borta by his side, Temüjin began to assert himself more openly as a leader in his own right. He offered protection to families who joined his camp, redistributed loot fairly after raids, and demanded discipline from his men. These policies, though strict, created a sense of order and security that was appealing in a chaotic world. His growing popularity, however, began to alarm rival leaders. The old tribal nobles saw Temüjin as a threat to their privileges. His openness to accepting followers from all walks of life, regardless of clan or ancestry, was considered dangerous. It challenged the foundation of steppe society. This tension was further inflamed when Temüjin received support from Togrul, the Khan of the Kherate tribe. Togrul had been an ally of Temüjin's father, Ogodei, and agreed to aid Temüjin in his efforts to consolidate power. The alliance was solidified through the exchange of gifts and mutual recognition. With Togrul's endorsement, Temüjin's status increased significantly. For a time, Temüjin, Jamuka, and Togrul formed a powerful triad. Together, they launched military campaigns against the Merkits, a rival tribe that had long harassed the Mongols and even posed a personal threat to Temüjin. In one of the most pivotal events of this early period, the Merkits kidnapped Borta in an act of vengeance, seeking to humiliate Temüjin and destabilize his growing influence. This crisis triggered one of the earliest and most decisive campaigns in Temüjin's career. He called upon both Jamuka and Togrul for aid. In a rare moment of united purpose, the three leaders combined their forces and launched a swift assault on the Merkit. The campaign was successful, Borta was rescued, and the Merkits were scattered. This victory elevated Temüjin's reputation and demonstrated his ability to command respect across tribal lines. Yet beneath the surface, the unity among the three leaders was already fraying. Temüjin's rise, his growing camp of followers, and his unorthodox leadership style were unsettling to Jamuka and other nobles. The rescued Borta soon gave birth to a son, Yochi. Though accepted by Temüjin, the child's paternity was questioned by others due to the circumstances of Borta's captivity. This added another layer of tension, both within Temüjin's household and among his political rivals. Despite these growing complications, Temüjin continued to expand his support base. He reorganized his followers into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, early signs of the military reforms he would later implement on a much larger scale. These groups were not formed along clan lines, but based on loyalty and function. This policy weakened the influence of traditional kinship and allowed Temüjin to integrate people from different tribes into a single, disciplined force. At the same time, he began to rely more heavily on key advisors and commanders who had proven themselves in the field. Figures like Borta and Yelme, who had stood by him during his lowest moments, were now entrusted with leadership roles. Others, such as Subutai and Jebe, would emerge in later years as brilliant military minds. The seeds of a new kind of leadership were being planted. The divergence between Temüjin and Jamuka eventually became impossible to ignore. Jamuka, backed by the old tribal elite, saw Temüjin's growing power as an existential threat to the traditional order. What had begun as a brotherhood of equals was becoming a rivalry of vision. One believed in preserving aristocracy, the other in building a new society based on merit and discipline. Their parting of ways was not just personal, it was ideological. The steppe was entering a period of transformation, and these two men represented the opposing paths forward. Their eventual clash would not simply be a battle for control, but a struggle over what the future of the Mongol world would look like. As Temüjin's influence continued to grow, the balance of power on the Mongolian steppe began to shift. His reputation for fairness, discipline, and military skill had earned him a growing number of loyal followers, many of whom had turned their backs on the traditional tribal elite to join his emerging camp. But this ascent was not without consequences. Rival factions, particularly those who saw Temüjin's rise as a threat to the old social order, watched his every move with suspicion. The first true test of Temüjin's emerging leadership came not in a battlefield between armies, but through a deeply personal crisis: the kidnapping of his wife, Borta. Shortly after their marriage, Borta and Temüjin returned to his camp near the Onon River. Though their union was politically strategic, it also carried genuine affection. Borta, from the influential Conquerad tribe, brought status and prestige to Temüjin's fledgling camp. More importantly, she became a symbol of unity and continuity in a world dominated by division. Their marriage represented the hope of stability, not only for their own families, but for a broader coalition of supporters who believed in Temüjin's vision. This hope was violently disrupted when the Merkits, one of the steppe's rival tribes, launched a sudden raid on Temüjin's camp. The Merkits had long held a grudge against Temüjin's family. Years earlier, Temüjin's father, Yasuge, had taken Hoylun, Temüjin's mother, from a Merkit man during a raid. Although such abductions were not uncommon on the steppe, they often created long-term feuds. The Merkits saw Temüjin's growing influence as an opportunity to strike and avenge their earlier humiliation. The raid was swift and devastating. Taken by surprise, Temüjin's forces were scattered, and Borta was captured and taken back to the Merkit camp. This was more than a personal loss. It was a direct attack on Temüjin's legitimacy. Without Borta, he risked losing the vital alliance with the Conquerad, and his status among other tribes could be severely weakened. The kidnapping threatened not only his marriage but his political future. Temüjin acted quickly. He sought help from two powerful allies, Togrul, the Khan of the Kharait, and Jamuka, his childhood Anda, and now an influential military leader in his own right. At this moment, the old bonds of friendship and mutual interest still held. Both leaders agreed to support Temüjin in a retaliatory campaign against the Merkits. This marked the first time that Temüjin led a coordinated campaign alongside other tribal leaders. It also revealed his ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the steppe. Though Togrul and Jamuka were powerful figures, Temüjin managed to convince them that assisting him was not only just, but also strategically valuable. By helping to rescue Borta, they could weaken a common enemy and reinforce their alliance. The joint force, made up of warriors from the Borjigin, Kharait, and Jadaran clans, set out toward the Merkit strongholds near the upper reaches of the Selenge River. The campaign was carefully planned. Temüjin emphasized speed and surprise, knowing that the Merkits were not expecting a counterattack so soon after their raid. The alliance struck hard and fast. The Merkits, unable to mount a coordinated defense, were routed. Their camps were burned, their supplies taken, and many of their people scattered into the forests and mountains. Borta was recovered during the raid, along with other captives. She had been held by a Merkit warrior named Chilger Buk, who claimed her as his wife. Although the time of her captivity was brief, its effects would echo for years. Borta was soon found to be pregnant, and in time gave birth to a son, whom they named Yochi. Temüjin publicly accepted the child as his own, showing loyalty and respect to Borta. However, doubts about Jochi's paternity would linger, especially among Temüjin's other sons and allies. These doubts would later create tensions in the question of succession. The rescue of Borta was a triumph that strengthened Temüjin's standing in several ways. First, it reaffirmed his loyalty to his wife and honored the bond between their two clans. Second, it showed his ability to mobilize allies and conduct effective military campaigns. Third, it demonstrated his growing independence from traditional tribal leaders. Although he had needed the help of Jamuka and Togrul, the campaign had been initiated by him and won under his leadership. Following the campaign, more families and warriors began to migrate toward Temüjin's camp. These included not only members of the Borjigin, but also individuals from lesser tribes who were impressed by Temüjin's fairness and strength. Among them were skilled horsemen, hunters, and craftsmen who added value to his growing movement. His camp began to resemble something more than a family unit. It was becoming a proto-state. Temüjin rewarded loyalty with generosity, distributing captured goods evenly among his followers and promoting warriors based on merit. He made a point of treating servants and lower status members with respect. This created a sharp contrast with the behavior of many aristocratic leaders, who often kept the spoils of war for themselves and treated commoners with disdain. As a result, Temüjin's camp became a magnet for those disillusioned with the rigid hierarchies of traditional steppe society. Meanwhile, Jamuka observed these developments with increasing concern. Though he had helped Temüjin in the campaign against the Merkits, it was becoming clear that his old friend was no longer content to play a secondary role in the political order. Temüjin's growing camp, his military success, and his open challenge to aristocratic norms positioned him as a rival rather than an ally. Still, for a time, open conflict was avoided. Both men returned to their respective territories and resumed consolidating their power. Temüjin continued to build relationships with neighboring tribes, including the Uruud and Mangkut. He offered not domination, but partnership, protection, fair treatment, and a share in future victories. This message resonated, especially among tribes that had suffered under the chaotic politics of the past. What made Temüjin's approach revolutionary was not simply his skill in war, but his vision of unity. He began to speak of a broader Mongol identity, not tied to one clan, but to shared loyalty and common purpose. This was new on the steppe. For generations, tribal loyalty had been absolute. Now, Temüjin was offering something different, a society based not on noble birth, but on commitment, ability, and shared destiny. The success of the campaign against the Merkits proved that his ideas could work. A temporary alliance of former rivals had been turned into a disciplined, victorious army. A political marriage had been restored, and a small, scattered band of followers was evolving into a powerful coalition. By the late 12th century, Temüjin was no longer just the son of a minor chieftain. Through personal charisma, strategic alliances, and victories in battle, he had grown from a clan leader into a rising political force. His camp attracted a diverse mix of warriors, families, and craftsmen drawn from many different tribes who were united not by kinship but by loyalty to his leadership. This development was rare on the Mongolian steppe, where power had traditionally been tied to aristocratic bloodlines and tribal hierarchies. Temüjin's most defining innovation during this period was his early emphasis on meritocracy. Rather than favoring members of his own Borjigin clan, he promoted individuals based on their loyalty and performance. A warrior's worth was proven in action, not inherited through lineage. Among those who rose through his ranks were men like Jelme, Boorchu, and Subutai, figures of humble origin who would become central to his military campaigns in the years to come. To support this new model of leadership, Temüjin reorganized his followers into decimal units, a structure that would later become a core feature of Mongol military administration. He began dividing his forces into groups of tens, hundreds, and thousands. These units broke the traditional clan divisions, allowing men from different backgrounds to serve together. The reorganization was both practical and symbolic. It forged a new collective identity and centralized authority under Temüjin's command. This system gave him a level of loyalty and cohesion that few other tribal leaders could match. While rival Khans often relied on family networks and temporary alliances, Temüjin built a more stable foundation rooted in personal bonds, shared hardship, and disciplined order. His followers respected him not because of ancient bloodlines, but because he delivered results: protection, fairness, and opportunity. One of Temüjin's greatest strengths was his understanding of political timing. He used the relative peace after the Merkit campaign to strengthen his internal structures, reward his followers, and expand his influence. He reached out to smaller clans who had been marginalized by the old aristocracy, offering them protection and a stake in his rising order. The Uru-Ud, Mangkut, and other minor groups responded positively, joining his camp and contributing fighters, supplies, and intelligence. This growing movement began to unsettle many of the traditional tribal leaders. They viewed Temüjin's inclusiveness as a threat to their own privileges. Among those most concerned was Jamuka. Though the two men had once stood together as Anda, sworn brothers, they now represented two fundamentally different political visions. Jamuka still operated within the established tribal elite. His support came primarily from noble families who believed that rule belonged to those of high birth. In contrast, Temüjin's coalition included commoners, outcasts, and ambitious men from all ranks. The underlying tension between the two leaders came to a head when Temüjin was elected Khan by a council of his followers. This gathering, likely held near the Onan River, represented the first Kurultai, a traditional assembly, called in his name. Though the title of Khan had been used before among tribal leaders, this moment marked a shift in political meaning. Temüjin's supporters were not simply confirming a clan chief. They were signaling the creation of a new political identity that transcended tribal boundaries. This move was viewed by many nobles as a direct challenge to the old order. Jamuka, now clearly positioned as Temüjin's rival, responded by consolidating his own coalition. Backed by members of the Jadaran, Taichi-Ud, and other aristocratic clans, he prepared to counter what he saw as an illegitimate rise. Though both men claimed to be unifiers, their methods and followers reflected two different Mongol worlds, one rooted in tradition and aristocracy, the other in merit and reform. The final break came in the year when Temüjin led a successful campaign that disrupted the trade routes controlled by Jamuka's allies. Control of trade and seasonal migration routes was vital on the steppe. Whoever held access to pastures, water sources, and trading posts could attract more families and livestock, increasing both economic power and political legitimacy. By undermining Jamuka's networks, Temüjin sent a clear message. He was no longer content to operate within the old framework. He intended to reshape it. Jamuka's response was swift. He accused Temüjin of overstepping his role, of threatening the unity of the Mongol tribes, and of promoting low-born individuals over noble blood. These accusations were more than political insults. They were a direct appeal to the traditional values of the steppe aristocracy. In their eyes, Temüjin's rise was not only illegitimate, but dangerous. The ideological divide between the two camps now mirrored a broader struggle across the Mongolian world. On one side stood the aristocratic coalition, proud of its heritage and committed to the customs of steppe leadership. On the other side stood a new force centered around Temüjin, which believed that unity and strength could only come through reform and loyalty to a shared purpose rather than lineage. Temüjin, aware of the coming conflict, continued to build support. He reinforced his military units, refined his logistical systems, and extended alliances through both diplomacy and marriage. He also began to formalize codes of conduct within his ranks, laying the groundwork for what would later become the Yasa, a legal and ethical code meant to enforce order and discipline among his followers. Though a full-scale war had not yet begun, the confrontation between Temüjin and Jamuka was now inevitable. Their personal history, once shaped by deep friendship, had become entangled with their political ambitions. The Anda bond that once symbolized trust now stood as a painful reminder of what had been lost. By the time the conflict between Temüjin and Jamuka came to a head, the fragile unity of the Mongol tribes had already fractured along ideological and social lines. Temüjin's vision of a merit-based, centrally organized coalition had gained traction among lower-status families, ambitious warriors, and minor clans. On the other hand, Jamuka remained the favored leader of the traditional aristocracy, supported by the established tribal nobility who wished to maintain the older social order. The tension between these two visions could no longer be contained through diplomacy or limited skirmishes. The rival camps prepared for war, drawing in followers from across the steppe. Temüjin's forces consisted of a coalition of loyal allies, Borjigin, Mangkut, Uruud, and others who had been excluded from previous aristocratic structures. Jamuka's army, by contrast, represented the entrenched elite, the Taichi-ud, Jadaran, and other powerful clans who feared the rise of Temüjin's new order. The decisive clash came in the year corresponding to 1187 near the place known as Dalan Baljut, located in what is now eastern Mongolia. Both sides brought substantial forces, but Temüjin's army was smaller in number. However, what his troops lacked in size, they made up for in cohesion, discipline, and loyalty. They were organized into structured units with clear leadership and were bound by personal allegiance to Temüjin's cause. Jamuka, though commanding a larger army, relied on the old tribal divisions, which often hindered coordinated action. His nobles viewed one another as rivals as much as allies, and cooperation across units was inconsistent. Still, his force held numerical superiority, and the battle that followed would prove decisive in the short term. Temüjin opened the engagement with aggressive tactics. His units, organized into groups of 100 and 1,000, maneuvered with precision. His generals, many of whom had fought alongside him in earlier campaigns, carried out their commands with speed and clarity. For much of the initial fighting, Temüjin's troops held their ground and inflicted heavy losses on Jamuka's men. But the tide eventually turned. Despite their determination, Temüjin's forces were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers. Jamuka's warriors encircled his units, and without reinforcements, Temüjin's line began to break. Realizing the danger of a complete collapse, he ordered a retreat to preserve what remained of his core force. The battle ended in defeat for Temüjin, a painful but critical moment in his journey. What followed the battle revealed the true depths of the divisions between the two factions. Jamuka, having captured many of Temüjin's men, carried out a brutal display meant to intimidate his rivals and assert dominance. 70 of Temüjin's top officers were executed by being boiled alive, a horrifying and public punishment that sent a clear message to all who might defy the old order. This act of cruelty shocked many on the steppe. Though violence was common in steppe warfare, the scale and method of the executions went beyond what was considered acceptable. Rather than strengthening Jamuka's position, the massacre alienated neutral clans and even caused unease among his own supporters. His victory had been decisive, but it lacked mercy, and in Mongol society, a leader who ruled through fear alone could not retain loyalty for long. Temüjin, meanwhile, went into exile. He withdrew with his remaining followers to the forests and hills near the upper reaches of the Onan River. Though weakened and disheartened, he did not lose the loyalty of his inner circle. Men like Jelme and Boorchu remained by his side, and Borta, his wife, continued to act as a stabilizing presence in his camp. During this period of retreat, Temüjin reassessed his strategies and focused on rebuilding. Rather than seeking immediate revenge, he turned inward, refining his military structure, deepening alliances with smaller clans, and strengthening the bonds that held his camp together. He emphasized discipline, justice, and equal treatment, qualities that drew in new supporters even in the wake of his defeat. Temüjin also learned from his mistakes. He recognized the limits of open confrontation with larger forces and began to adopt more flexible strategies, including surprise attacks, feigned retreats, and careful preparation of terrain. These tactics would later become hallmarks of Mongol warfare and contribute to some of the most successful campaigns in military history. More importantly, the defeat at Dalan Baljut sharpened Temüjin's understanding of leadership. He saw how internal divisions could be exploited, how brutality could backfire, and how essential it was to unify people not only through fear, but through shared purpose. Unlike Jamuka, who ruled through lineage and privilege, Temüjin offered a model based on accountability and reward for service. In the years that followed, Temüjin rebuilt his coalition. His network expanded to include not only warriors, but also skilled administrators, messengers, and artisans. He strengthened his ties with the Kharat under Togrul, who remained an important, if sometimes unpredictable, ally. Through diplomacy and generosity, he attracted new families and tribes who had grown disillusioned with Jamuka's harsh methods. The exile period also marked the beginning of more formal legal and administrative structures in Temüjin's camp. He began to issue orders that governed the behavior of his followers, not just in battle, but in daily life. These orders, later codified as part of the Yasa, included rules on theft, loyalty, desertion, and the treatment of prisoners. The aim was to create a unified society bound by law as well as loyalty, where even the Khan himself was subject to codes of conduct. In the broader context of Mongol history, the Battle of Dalan Baljut was not simply a military engagement. It was a turning point in the ideological war between two visions of leadership. Though Temüjin lost the battle, he won something more important: the moral high ground and the long-term loyalty of his followers. His emphasis on merit, justice, and unity began to resonate more widely, particularly among clans weary of aristocratic arrogance and internal violence. Jamuka, though still powerful, had begun to lose the momentum. His brutal tactics and reliance on noble families limited his ability to adapt or expand. In contrast, Temüjin's exile became a period of transformation, turning defeat into preparation for a larger, more strategic return. In the wake of his defeat at Dalan Baljut, Temüjin did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he entered a period of strategic reflection, renewal, and slow rebuilding that would ultimately culminate in a transformation not only of his own fortunes, but of the entire Mongol steppe. Over the next 2 decades, Temüjin steadily gathered strength, militarily, politically, and ideologically, by applying the lessons learned from earlier setbacks and forging a new kind of leadership grounded in loyalty, merit, and justice. The first key to his resurgence lay in his deepening alliances. Despite the crushing defeat and the loss of many men, Temüjin retained the trust of his closest companions and core followers. He continued to expand his network by reaching out to smaller, marginalized clans who had long been excluded from the political dominance of the tribal aristocracy. These groups, often overlooked by other tribal leaders, found in Temüjin a protector and a unifier who valued service over lineage. He offered them inclusion, protection, and an equal stake in his growing confederation. One of the most important relationships Temüjin cultivated during this time was with Togrul, Khan of the Kharat. Togrul had been a longtime ally of Temüjin's father Yesugei, and at various points had acted as a mentor and sponsor. Their alliance was mutually beneficial. Temüjin gained legitimacy and access to Kharat military resources, while Togrul benefited from Temüjin's disciplined followers and battlefield acumen. For a time, their partnership strengthened both camps and posed a serious challenge to Jamuka and the traditionalist elite. However, this alliance would not last. Over time, internal divisions within the Kharat court, particularly the jealousy of Togrul's son Sengum, undermined Temüjin's position. Sengum, threatened by Temüjin's rising influence, launched a surprise attack that nearly killed him. Temüjin narrowly escaped and rallied his forces for a counteroffensive. In a dramatic reversal, Temüjin defeated the Kharat in a decisive campaign, scattering the remnants of their leadership and absorbing many of their warriors and administrators into his own ranks. This victory marked a turning point. With the Kharat defeated, Temüjin now controlled large swaths of territory and held sway over numerous tribes. Many former enemies voluntarily submitted to his authority, recognizing his strength and fair treatment of those who joined his cause. Even members of aristocratic clans who had once opposed him began to see the advantages of aligning with his rising power. Meanwhile, Jamuka's position weakened. Though he continued to resist Temüjin's expansion, his base of support eroded. The memory of the executions following Dalan Baljut, along with his rigid adherence to tribal hierarchies, made him increasingly isolated. Many who had once followed him defected to Temüjin, drawn by the promise of a new order built on justice and mutual benefit. Temüjin's consolidation of power was not solely military. He implemented a system of governance that further differentiated him from other steppe leaders. He formalized his earlier military reforms, organizing his forces into decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Commanders of these units were chosen based on proven loyalty and competence, not family ties. This allowed for more effective coordination in both military campaigns and domestic administration. He also began to establish rules that regulated life within his growing domain. These rules included provisions on theft, adultery, loyalty, and treatment of prisoners. They were enforced strictly, with punishments applied equally regardless of status. This legal structure, the early form of what would become known as the Yasa, helped establish a sense of order and predictability in a world that had long been shaped by arbitrary power and personal revenge. By the early years of the 13th century, Temüjin had accomplished what no other leader in Mongol history had managed. He had unified a majority of the tribes under a single, centralized authority. This was not achieved by brute force alone, but through a carefully constructed alliance of military discipline, legal reform, and inclusive governance. His power base now extended across the eastern and central steppe regions, with loyal generals and administrators managing the daily affairs of an increasingly complex polity. The final step in formalizing this transformation came in the spring of the year 1206, when Temüjin called a Grand Kurultai, a traditional Mongol council of chiefs and nobles on the banks of the Onan River. Leaders and envoys from dozens of tribes gathered to participate in what would become one of the most significant political events in the history of the steppe. At this gathering, the assembled leaders proclaimed Temüjin as Genghis Khan, a title whose meaning is debated among historians, but is generally interpreted as universal ruler or oceanic Khan, suggesting vast, unmatched authority. The declaration was not simply a ceremonial recognition of personal power. It was a foundational moment in the creation of a unified Mongol state. The title of Genghis Khan symbolized a break from the past. It marked the transition from fragmented tribal politics to a new form of governance based on centralized rule and codified law. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongol identity would begin to transcend clan and tribal divisions, creating a more cohesive and durable political entity. The Kurultai also served to legitimize the social and military reforms Temüjin had introduced. His most trusted generals, Jelme, Boorchu, Subutai, and Jebe, were confirmed in positions of authority. Key families and allied tribes were given responsibilities for managing different regions. The decimal military structure was reaffirmed as the backbone of the state. It was a moment of consolidation where power was redistributed based on loyalty and function rather than heritage. Importantly, the new Khan did not proclaim himself ruler by divine right alone. Though the Mongols believed in the favor of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan emphasized that his authority came also from the consent of his people and the strength of their shared purpose. This notion of a quasi-contractual relationship between ruler and ruled added a layer of legitimacy that extended beyond traditional clan loyalty. The proclamation of Genghis Khan was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new one. The Mongol tribes had been unified, but the world beyond the steppe still lay divided and vulnerable. The new Khan understood that internal unity could only be preserved through external purpose. To maintain discipline and momentum, his people needed new challenges, new enemies, new campaigns, and new lands to conquer. Following his proclamation as Genghis Khan in the year 1206, Temüjin stood at the head of a newly unified Mongol nation. Yet for all the power he now commanded, internal stability alone could not satisfy the ambitions of a leader who saw conquest as both a political necessity and a divine mandate. The Mongol Confederation had been forged through warfare, loyalty, and vision. But to maintain its momentum and unity, it now needed a common purpose beyond the steppe. That purpose emerged in the form of the Western Xia Kingdom, known to the Mongols as the Tangut State. Located to the southwest of Mongolia, the Western Xia occupied a strategically valuable region along the Hexi Corridor and the Upper Yellow River. This kingdom, ruled by the Tangut people, had long been a key player in the geopolitics of northern China. It controlled trade routes linking the Silk Road to the Chinese heartland and had a well-fortified system of cities and outposts that protected its borders from nomadic incursions. The Western Xia were not strangers to steppe warfare. For generations, they had alternated between trade and conflict with various nomadic groups. However, they now faced a very different kind of threat. Genghis Khan was not merely leading a tribal raid. He was directing a disciplined, centralized force with a unified command structure and clear strategic goals. This would be the Mongols' first test against a settled bureaucratic state, and it would mark the beginning of their transformation from a regional power into an imperial force. Genghis Khan's motivations for attacking the Western Xia were both practical and symbolic. On a practical level, he sought to secure the trade routes that passed through the Hexi Corridor and gain access to the wealth of Chinese goods, silk, grain, metalwork, and precious stones. These resources were critical to sustaining and rewarding his growing military and administrative class. Symbolically, the campaign offered a chance to demonstrate Mongol power on a new stage, sending a message to neighboring dynasties that the steppe had produced a ruler of unmatched ambition. The campaign began in the year 1207, when Mongol forces crossed into Tangut territory. Genghis Khan divided his army into coordinated columns, using speed and surprise to overwhelm the frontier defenses. His forces avoided prolonged sieges in the early phase, instead focusing on mobility, psychological pressure, and the destruction of supply lines. The aim was not immediate conquest, but destabilization, to force the Tanguts into a defensive posture and prevent them from coordinating a unified response. One of the key early victories came at the city of Wulahai, located near the Ordos region. Rather than launch a direct assault, Genghis Khan used feigned retreats and night attacks to confuse the defenders. This tactic, luring enemies into overextending their lines, would become a signature element of Mongol warfare. After several days of harassment, the garrison collapsed and the city fell. From there, the Mongol army pressed further into Western Xia territory, targeting both military garrisons and supply depots. Genghis Khan made use of intelligence networks to gather information on enemy movements, terrain, and internal divisions. He employed local guides and defectors, some of whom were captured during the early raids and persuaded, through reward or fear, to assist the Mongols in navigating unfamiliar terrain. As the campaign progressed, the Western Xia court realized that the Mongol threat was unlike anything they had encountered before. Their appeals for help to the neighboring Jin Dynasty went largely unanswered. The Jin, preoccupied with their own challenges and underestimating the Mongols, declined to intervene. This isolation would prove disastrous for the Tanguts, who now faced a siege without allies. The Mongols then turned their attention to the capital of the Western Xia, Zhongxing, known today as Yinchuan. This city was a formidable target, protected by high walls, defensive moats, and a well-trained garrison. The decision to besiege such a fortified center marked a new phase in Mongol warfare. Until this point, Mongol armies had specialized in mobile engagements and steppe tactics. The siege of Zhongxing required different skills: engineering, patience, and sustained supply lines. To meet this challenge, Genghis Khan ordered the construction of siege engines. Captured Chinese engineers, skilled in the use of catapults, battering rams, and fire-based weapons, were integrated into the Mongol forces. Their knowledge proved invaluable. The Mongols began bombarding the city with stone projectiles and fire pots, causing structural damage and psychological fear among the defenders. However, the siege did not lead to an immediate breakthrough. Zhongxing held out for months. During this time, the Mongols demonstrated both adaptability and ruthlessness. They diverted a nearby river in an attempt to flood the city, showing an early use of environmental manipulation in siege warfare. Though the flooding failed to breach the walls completely, it damaged morale and disrupted the city's water supply. Eventually, the Western Xia agreed to negotiate. The Tangut ruler, Emperor Xiangzong, offered tribute: horses, camels, gold, and submission in exchange for peace. Genghis Khan accepted, but he did not dismantle the kingdom entirely. He allowed the Western Xia to remain a vassal state, but only under strict conditions of loyalty and tribute. The Mongols withdrew, but they left behind a message. Resistance would bring ruin, submission would bring survival. This outcome served multiple purposes. First, it allowed Genghis Khan to test his military systems without overextending his resources. Second, it sent a clear signal to other Chinese states, particularly the Jin Dynasty, that the Mongols had become a serious geopolitical force. Third, it provided a model for future campaigns: shock, disruption, siege, and negotiated submission. Equally important was the internal effect on Mongol society. The campaign against the Western Xia was a proving ground for new commanders, many of whom would rise to prominence in later conquests. Subutai, Jebe, and others distinguished themselves through initiative, strategic insight, and loyalty. These leaders formed the backbone of what would become one of the most feared military machines in history. The success of the Western Xia campaign also enriched the Mongol economy. Tribute and captured goods were distributed across the army and the broader population. This helped reinforce loyalty, maintain morale, and demonstrate that service to the Khan brought tangible rewards. Genghis Khan's policy of wealth redistribution after conquest stood in contrast to the hoarding practices of many other rulers and contributed to the unity of his growing empire. By the end of the campaign, the Mongols had secured their first major victory over a sedentary state. It was a signal moment in history. The steppe had produced a power capable of confronting and defeating established kingdoms with fortified cities, written laws, and standing armies. The Mongols had adapted their traditional strengths to a new kind of warfare, and they had done so under a leader who understood both the sword and the system. Following the Mongols' successful campaign against the Western Xia kingdom, Genghis Khan turned his attention toward a much more formidable opponent: the Jin Dynasty. The Jin, ruled by the Jurchen people, controlled northern China and held sway over a vast and wealthy territory that stretched from the Mongolian frontier to the Yellow River Basin. Unlike the smaller Tangut Kingdom, the Jin were a powerful imperial force with a standing army, fortified cities, and centuries of bureaucratic administration. However, the relationship between the steppe nomads and the Jin dynasty had long been fraught with tension. The Jurchens had historically sought to manipulate the tribal politics of the Mongolian plateau by pitting clans against each other. They had once allied with the Tatars and used them to undermine the Mongol tribes, including Temüjin's own Borjigin. Furthermore, the Jin dynasty often demanded tribute and submission from the nomads, treating them as inferior subjects. For Genghis Khan, who had united the Mongol tribes into a disciplined confederation, this was not only an insult, it was an unacceptable challenge to his authority. The decision to invade Jin territory was driven by multiple factors. Strategically, Genghis Khan sought to secure the fertile northern Chinese plains, which offered agricultural wealth, urban infrastructure, and trade routes. Politically, he aimed to break the Jin's influence over the borderlands and prevent them from interfering in Mongol affairs. Ideologically, the invasion would demonstrate to both his people and the world that the Mongols were no longer a peripheral force, but a rising empire with imperial ambitions. The campaign began in the year 1211. Genghis Khan assembled a large and well-coordinated force, drawing from various Mongol clans as well as allied tribes. His army, though less numerous than the Jin's, was vastly superior in mobility, cohesion, and tactical innovation. The Mongols had mastered the use of feigned retreats, encirclements, and coordinated multi-pronged attacks. Their command structure, based on units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, allowed for quick communication and disciplined execution in battle. The initial invasion route led the Mongol forces across the Great Wall into the Jin-controlled steppe zones. These areas were sparsely defended, and the Mongols advanced rapidly, targeting smaller garrisons and supply depots. Rather than heading straight for the capital, Genghis Khan adopted a scorched earth approach, systematically dismantling the Jin's logistical base and forcing their armies to react to multiple threats at once. One of the first major cities to fall was Datong, an important military stronghold near the frontier. The Mongols laid siege to the city and employed captured Chinese engineers to construct siege equipment. After breaching the walls, they sacked the city and executed many of its defenders. This victory sent shockwaves across the region and demonstrated the Mongols' capacity for siege warfare, something many sedentary states had underestimated in a nomadic army. Genghis Khan then advanced toward Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin Dynasty, known today as Beijing. The siege of Zhongdu would become one of the most significant events of the early Mongol conquests. The city was heavily fortified and defended by a large garrison, but it also suffered from internal divisions and shortages caused by the Mongols' previous raids. Rather than launching a direct assault, Genghis Khan surrounded the city and cut off its supply routes. His forces built trenches and earthworks to isolate the defenders. Siege engines, including catapults and trebuchets operated by Chinese and Muslim engineers, hurled stones and fire projectiles over the walls. The bombardment lasted for months, weakening the city's defenses and demoralizing its population. Inside the walls, famine and disease began to take hold. Desperate to end the siege, the Jin court attempted negotiations, offering tribute in exchange for peace. Genghis Khan agreed to a temporary withdrawal, accepting vast sums of silk, gold, and silver, but only to return shortly after when it became clear that the Jin were regrouping. The final assault on Zhongdu was brutal. After months of encirclement and repeated attacks, the Mongols breached the walls and entered the city. What followed was a devastating sack. Mongol troops looted the wealth of the capital, set fire to key buildings, and executed large numbers of soldiers and officials. The destruction of Zhongdu was symbolic as well as strategic. It shattered the image of the Jin Dynasty's invincibility and opened the northern Chinese plains to further Mongol incursions. Following this catastrophic loss, the Jin court fled south to Kaifeng, abandoning their northern capital. The dynasty continued to exist in name, but its power was broken. The Jin were now forced into a defensive posture, relying on remaining fortresses and fragmented military units to slow the Mongol advance. Over the next few years, Genghis Khan allowed his generals to conduct further operations across northern China, targeting trade routes, granaries, and administrative centers. The goal was not only to extract wealth, but to dismantle the Jin state's ability to function. One of the key consequences of the campaign was the integration of Chinese administrators and artisans into the Mongol system. Rather than destroying all urban centers, Genghis Khan began to see the value of skilled captives. Artisans, scribes, engineers, and merchants were spared and redistributed throughout the Mongol heartland. Their expertise contributed to the development of infrastructure, military technology, and administrative practices within the growing Mongol Empire. Another important outcome was the sharpening of Mongol siege capabilities. The invasion of the Jin had forced Genghis Khan to adapt his traditional tactics to the challenges of urban warfare. His commanders became adept at coordinating cavalry assaults with siege operations. This combination of mobility and engineering would serve the Mongols well in future campaigns across Central Asia and the Middle East. Moreover, the conquest of the Jin exposed the Mongols to the complexities of Chinese statecraft. They encountered systems of taxation, law, record-keeping, and regional governance that differed greatly from the tribal customs of the steppe. Genghis Khan, ever pragmatic, began to incorporate elements of these systems into his own administration, especially through the use of Chinese advisors and bureaucrats. The psychological impact of the Mongol invasion was profound. The image of an unstoppable force from the north, fast, ruthless, and seemingly immune to the rules of conventional warfare, spread terror across the region. Yet, it also attracted attention. Many groups, particularly minorities and frontier peoples, saw in the Mongols a chance to escape the rigid hierarchies of the old dynasties. They offered their allegiance in exchange for protection or autonomy, further expanding the reach of Genghis Khan's influence. By the end of this campaign, the Jin Dynasty had lost much of its northern territory and had been forced into a long and slow decline. The Mongols had not yet conquered all of China, but they had decisively shattered the northern imperial order and proven that the steppe could challenge the might of established empires. For Genghis Khan, the victory over the Jin was not merely a conquest. It was a validation of his leadership model, his military reforms, and his broader vision for Mongol greatness. He had moved beyond tribal politics and into the realm of empire building, transforming his people from raiders into rulers. After the Mongol conquest of northern China and the decisive blow dealt to the Jin Dynasty, Genghis Khan turned his gaze westward. His conquests thus far had demonstrated not only military superiority, but also a keen understanding of politics, diplomacy, and trade. Now at the helm of a powerful and organized empire, Genghis Khan sought new opportunities, particularly along the Silk Road, the lifeline of intercontinental commerce stretching from China to the Islamic world. In the early decades of the 13th century, one of the most prosperous and strategically positioned kingdoms along this route was the Khwarazmian Empire. Stretching across parts of modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, the Khwarazmian Empire was governed by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II. His court controlled major trade hubs such as Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench. These cities were centers of learning, commerce, and Islamic culture, and they sat directly along the channels that connected East Asia with the Middle East and Europe. Initially, Genghis Khan did not approach the Khwarazmians with hostility. On the contrary, he aimed to establish peaceful trade relations. With the Mongol heartland growing more interconnected with conquered Chinese territory, Genghis Khan understood the value of diplomatic ties and stable markets. He sent a large caravan of merchants westward, carrying valuable goods, silk, gold, silver, and fine textiles, along with official documentation that identified them as representatives of the Mongol Empire. But the Khwarazmian Empire, under the rule of the ambitious and deeply suspicious Shah Muhammad, did not trust these overtures. When the caravan arrived in the border city of Otrar, the local governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of espionage. Acting without clear evidence, he arrested them, confiscated their goods, and, according to Mongol accounts, executed several members of the party. Genghis Khan responded with restraint at first. Believing the incident could be resolved diplomatically, he sent a delegation of 3 ambassadors to the Khwarazmian court, demanding the release of the survivors and punishment of Inalchuk. This move was not only reasonable, but aligned with established norms of international conduct. But Shah Muhammad committed an act that would change the course of history. He executed one of the Mongol envoys and publicly humiliated the others by shaving their heads, an act of deep insult in both Mongol and Islamic tradition. For Genghis Khan, this was more than a diplomatic slight. It was a direct violation of one of the most sacred codes of the steppe. In Mongol culture, harming an envoy was equivalent to declaring war. Ambassadors, regardless of their message, were to be treated with dignity and safety. The Shah's decision shattered any possibility of peaceful relations and triggered one of the most ruthless military responses in medieval history. In the year following the insult, Genghis Khan mobilized his forces. Estimates suggest he led an army of more than 100,000 men, including elite cavalry units, engineers, and scouts. He organized the campaign with extraordinary precision, dividing his army into multiple columns to attack from different directions and disorient the Khwarazmian defense. The first target was the city of Otrar, where the crisis had begun. The Mongols besieged the city for several months. Once they broke through the defenses, they captured Inalchuk and executed him, reportedly by pouring molten silver into his eyes and mouth, a grim punishment said to reflect the Mongols' fury and sense of justice. The city was sacked, its population decimated, and its infrastructure destroyed. From there, Genghis Khan's forces moved swiftly across Central Asia, targeting key cities with both overwhelming force and calculated terror. Bukhara, one of the great Islamic centers of the region, fell after a brief siege. Genghis Khan himself is said to have addressed the city's residents from the mosque, declaring that he was the punishment of God, sent because of their sins. Whether apocryphal or not, the statement reflects the psychological dominance the Mongols wielded over their enemies. Samarkand, another jewel of the Khwarazmian realm, fell soon after. The city boasted thick walls, a large garrison, and war elephants, symbols of its military pride. But none of these defenses could stop the Mongols. Using catapults and coordinated attacks, they breached the walls. Many of the defenders surrendered, only to be executed later when they were deemed unreliable. Skilled artisans and engineers were spared and sent east to serve the Mongol Empire. The rest of the population suffered mass slaughter. As city after city fell, Shah Muhammad fled westward. Rather than rallying his forces to defend the empire, he abandoned his capitals and sought refuge in remote fortresses along the Caspian Sea. Pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments, he eventually died in exile, alone, discredited, and stripped of his crown. His son, Jalal ad-Din, tried to regroup and mount resistance. A capable military leader, Jalal ad-Din gathered an army and attempted to defend what remained of the Khwarazmian domain. In one notable confrontation along the banks of the Indus River, he fought a fierce battle against a Mongol force and managed to escape across the water. Impressed by his bravery, Genghis Khan reportedly ordered his archers not to fire at the fleeing prince, remarking that a father could not be angry at such a valiant son. But the admiration did not stop the destruction. The Mongol campaign continued westward, reaching as far as the Caucasus and the edges of the Persian plateau. Cities that resisted were destroyed, fields were burned, irrigation systems dismantled, and entire regions depopulated. The Mongols practiced a form of strategic annihilation, crushing resistance not just to defeat an enemy, but to prevent any future challenge to their dominance. Beyond the military dimension, the Khwarazmian campaign revealed the full scope of Mongol planning and coordination. The Mongol army was not just a horde of horsemen. It was a structured, professional force capable of long-distance campaigns, siege warfare, and strategic deception. Intelligence played a crucial role. Mongol scouts operated deep behind enemy lines, mapping terrain, monitoring enemy movements, and identifying weak points. Communications were managed through an early version of a courier relay system that allowed orders to travel faster than any enemy response. The consequences of the Khwarazmian disaster were immense. In a matter of a few short years, an entire empire was wiped from the map. The Silk Road trade network was severely disrupted. Islamic scholars and institutions suffered irreparable losses, and millions were displaced or killed. The scale of devastation shocked the Islamic world and left a lasting scar across Central Asia. Yet for the Mongols, the campaign was a triumph. It demonstrated that no empire, no matter how wealthy, advanced, or ancient, could withstand their wrath if it disrespected Mongol diplomacy or sovereignty. It also expanded the Mongol Empire dramatically, bringing it into contact with new cultures, religions, and administrative systems. The conquest of the Khwarazmian Empire would pave the way for future Mongol advances into Persia, the Caucasus, and even Europe. While the full might of Genghis Khan's empire was focused on crushing the Khwarazmian Empire, a parallel operation was unfolding further west, one that would lay the foundations for future Mongol conquests in Europe. This operation, led by two of Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals, Subutai and Jabi, was not a full-scale invasion. Rather, it was a reconnaissance in force, a long-range expedition designed to gather intelligence, test the strength of potential enemies, and scout the terrain of unknown lands. This mission would become one of the most extraordinary military journeys of the medieval period. Spanning years and covering thousands of miles, the campaign brought Mongol forces into direct contact with the Caucasus, the Russian principalities, the Cuman Steppe, and the fringes of Eastern Europe. Along the way, the Mongols would defeat coalition armies, destroy fortified cities, and return with detailed knowledge that would later be used in the sweeping invasions of the 13th century. The origins of the mission can be traced to the aftermath of the Khwarazmian campaign. As Shah Muhammad fled westward, his son Jalal ad-Din retreated through Persia toward the Indus. But several of the Khwarazmian generals and loyalists escaped into the Caucasus. Genghis Khan, determined to ensure there would be no revival of resistance, tasked Subutai and Jebe with hunting down these remnants. But the mission quickly expanded into a deeper exploration of the western frontier. Subutai and Jebe were well suited for the task. Subutai, born into the Uriankai clan, had risen from humble origins to become one of Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders. Known for his brilliance in strategy and logistics, he was equally comfortable managing sieges, cavalry raids, and diplomatic deception. Jebe, once an enemy of Genghis Khan, who had impressed the Khan in battle and been spared, had since become one of the empire's most daring and effective field commanders. Together, the two generals led a force numbering in the tens of thousands. These troops were handpicked for mobility and endurance. Unlike the main Mongol armies, this expedition had no intention of holding territory or garrisoning cities. It was built for speed, flexibility, and stealth. The goal was to move deep into unfamiliar lands, identify the power structures in place, and assess whether those lands might pose a future threat or present an opportunity. The Mongols entered the Caucasus through the Derbent Pass, a narrow mountain corridor that connected Central Asia to the western steppes. There they encountered a confederation of various peoples, Georgians, Alans, Lezgins, and others, who had formed alliances in response to news of the Mongol advance. The Mongols first attempted diplomacy, offering alliances or neutrality in exchange for safe passage. When these overtures failed, they resorted to military force. In the initial skirmishes, the Mongols faced stiff resistance, particularly from the Alans and Georgians. These groups had fortified positions and experience in mountain warfare. However, the Mongols employed a classic tactic. They offered to make peace with the Cumans, steppe nomads who had allied with the Caucasian defenders, and then used that alliance to isolate and destroy the remaining forces one by one. By breaking the unity of their enemies, they gained the upper hand and emerged victorious. After subduing the Caucasus region, the Mongols pushed northward onto the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the homeland of the Cumans, also known as Kipchaks. The Cumans were powerful nomadic tribes with strong cavalry traditions and deep influence among the Turkic peoples of the western steppe. For decades, they had been dominant in the region and had formed various alliances with Slavic principalities to the north, particularly among the Rus. When it became clear that the Mongols intended to assert control over the steppe, the Cumans sent messengers to the Rus princes, urging them to form a united front. The principalities of Kiev, Galicia Volhynia, Chernigov, and others responded by assembling a coalition army. In the spring of the year, corresponding to 1223, this combined force of Ruses and Cuman warriors prepared to face the Mongols near the banks of the Kalka River. The Battle of the Kalka River would become one of the most revealing moments of Mongol military prowess in the West. The Rus-Cuman coalition had numerical superiority and fought on familiar terrain, but they lacked the coordination, discipline, and speed of the Mongol forces. Subutai and Jebe feigned a retreat, drawing the allied army into a pursuit that stretched their formation and exhausted their troops. When the coalition was sufficiently disorganized, the Mongols turned and struck with devastating force. The result was a rout. The Rus' army was annihilated, their commanders killed or captured. Mstislav of Kiev, one of the leading princes, was taken alive and later executed under gruesome circumstances. According to some accounts, he and other nobles were suffocated under wooden boards as Mongol commanders feasted above them, a symbolic display of domination. With the coalition shattered, the Mongols briefly raided deeper into the Rus' lands, reaching the outskirts of cities such as Kiev and Novgorod. However, they did not attempt to conquer or occupy these territories. Their mission had always been reconnaissance, and their objectives had now been achieved. They had tested the political and military resolve of the Western powers, identified key strategic routes, and collected vast amounts of intelligence. Subutai and Jebe's forces then began the long return journey east, moving through the southern steppe and eventually reuniting with the main Mongol forces. The entire campaign had lasted several years, covered thousands of miles, and involved dozens of battles, negotiations, and logistical feats. Though often overlooked in the larger narrative of Mongol conquests, this mission was critical. It provided Genghis Khan with the knowledge he would later use to launch full-scale invasions of Europe under his successors. One of the key takeaways from the Western reconnaissance was the realization that the kingdoms and principalities of Europe were divided and often slow to respond to external threats. Their armies, while numerous, lacked the cohesion and adaptability of the Mongol system. Their fortifications could be overcome with siege technology, and their political systems were vulnerable to manipulation. Subutai and Jebi also demonstrated that Mongol forces could operate far from their base of supply, across diverse terrains and climates, while maintaining discipline and morale. Their campaign became a textbook example of long-range strategic warfare, admired and studied by military historians for centuries to come. For the peoples of the Caucasus and the Rus, the campaign left a lasting impression. It introduced them to a new kind of enemy, one that did not conform to the traditional expectations of warfare. The Mongols struck with speed, avoided predictable patterns, and combined diplomacy, terror, and tactical brilliance in ways that were difficult to counter. By the mid to late 1220s, shortly after the devastating campaigns in Central Asia and the long-ranging reconnaissance mission to the west, Genghis Khan had established the Mongol Empire as the most formidable power of its time. Its territory now extended from the borders of Korea and the Yellow Sea in the east to the fringes of the Caspian in the west. Yet despite these outward achievements, Genghis Khan turned his attention inward, recognizing that the survival of his empire would depend not only on conquest, but on continuity. The question of succession weighed heavily on his mind. Genghis Khan, now aging and aware of his mortality, understood that even the most powerful ruler could not rule forever. Without a clear plan, the empire he had built could fracture along tribal lines or descend into civil war. To ensure stability, he needed to determine which of his sons would carry on his legacy as Great Khan. Temüjin, Genghis Khan's birth name, had 4 sons by his principal wife, Borta, Yoshi, Chagatai, Ogodei, and Tolui. Each had proven themselves in various capacities during the conquests. They had commanded armies, governed regions, and played key roles in the administration of the empire. But their personalities, loyalties, and ambitions differed sharply, and selecting one as successor would not be a simple matter. Yoshi, the eldest, was a gifted commander and had taken part in many campaigns. He was instrumental in the defeat of the Khwarazmian Empire, particularly in the western regions. However, there remained persistent doubts about his legitimacy. Born soon after Borta's rescue from the Merkits, questions lingered among the Mongol aristocracy about whether Yoshi was truly Temüjin's biological son. Although Genghis Khan had accepted him publicly and treated him as his own, these rumors undermined Yoshi's standing among his brothers and other nobles. In addition to doubts over his birth, Yoshi's relationship with his father had become strained. He often favored negotiation over destruction and had shown reluctance during the sacking of certain cities, most notably Urgench. Genghis Khan reportedly viewed this hesitancy as a sign of weakness or disobedience. Their disagreements grew to the point that Yoshi withdrew to his own territories along the western edge of the empire, ruling semi-independently. While still nominally loyal, he distanced himself from the core leadership in the east. Chagatai, the second son, was loyal and zealous in his support of Mongol customs and law. He was known for his fiery temper and strong sense of justice, but also for his rigidity. Chagatai had been among the most vocal critics of Yoshi's claim to legitimacy, a position that exacerbated the feud between the brothers. Genghis Khan feared that naming either Yoshi or Chagatai as his successor could lead to bloodshed or division. Tolui, the youngest, had proven himself as a fierce and capable general. He remained closest to his father in both geography and temperament. During the Khwarazmian campaign, Tolui led devastating assaults in Persia, often serving as the sharp edge of Mongol military power. However, he was still relatively young and lacked the broad administrative experience needed to manage the vast empire. This left Ogodei, the third son. Of all the brothers, Ogodei was seen as the most balanced and pragmatic. He had participated in the major campaigns and had shown talent not only on the battlefield but also in matters of governance and diplomacy. He did not provoke hostility from his brothers to the same extent as Jochi or Chagatai, and he was respected by the Mongol nobility. Most importantly, he had his father's trust. Sometime around the year 1223, Genghis Khan began hinting that Ogodei would be his successor. The formal process, however, required delicate handling. Mongol tradition called for a kurultai, a grand council of nobles and tribal leaders, to approve the selection of a new Khan. Though the great Khan's will carried enormous influence, open consensus was needed to preserve unity and legitimacy. Before making any final declarations, Genghis Khan summoned his sons, trusted generals, and advisors to consult on the matter. His aim was not merely to anoint a successor, but to establish a model of succession that could endure. He emphasized the need for loyalty to the empire as a whole, not just to a specific lineage. The Mongol world, now multi-ethnic and sprawling, needed centralized leadership and continuity. Despite lingering tensions, the brothers ultimately agreed to accept Ogodei's nomination, though not without private reservations. Jochi's premature death, shortly before Genghis Khan's own passing, helped defuse the immediate succession crisis. While his son, Batu, would later become a powerful figure in the western part of the empire, Jochi himself was no longer a contender. Chagatai accepted the arrangement, especially after being promised significant authority over Central Asia. Tolui, though passed over for the title, remained loyal and continued to serve as military commander and guardian of the homeland. In preparation for the transition, Genghis Khan implemented reforms to strengthen the central administration. He appointed scribes, tax officials, and governors in key regions. He expanded the use of the relay station system, the YAM, which allowed messengers to travel swiftly across the empire. These logistical advancements ensured that Ogodei and his successors could govern effectively even across vast distances. The emphasis on record-keeping and communication reflected a major shift in Mongol governance. While the early empire had relied heavily on personal loyalty and military organization, it was now evolving into a more bureaucratic state. The integration of Chinese, Persian, and Uyghur administrators allowed for a blend of traditions, with Mongol rulers maintaining oversight while delegating tasks to experienced officials. Genghis Khan also continued to consult shamans and spiritual advisors during this time. He believed deeply in the guidance of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and sought spiritual legitimacy for his decisions. The succession, in his view, was not only a matter of politics, but of divine approval. By framing Ogodei's rise as aligned with heavenly will, he sought to minimize dissent and ensure smooth acceptance among the Mongol clans. Even as he prepared for succession, Genghis Khan did not abandon military affairs. He launched a final campaign against the Western Xia kingdom, punishing them for perceived disloyalty during his previous wars. But at home, his focus remained on consolidation and preparation. By the time he returned to the Mongolian heartland in the mid-20s of the 13th century, Genghis Khan had achieved something unprecedented. He had created an empire that stretched across continents, unified previously warring tribes, and developed systems of governance that would outlast him. Yet he understood that empires fall not only by external attack, but by internal division. The orderly transition of power to Ogodei was meant to prevent such a fate. In the twilight of his life, Genghis Khan, the master of the steppe and sovereign of the greatest land empire the world had yet seen, returned his attention to one unfinished matter: the kingdom of Western Xia. Though previously subdued, the Tangut rulers of Western Xia had begun to show signs of disloyalty during the Mongol campaigns in Central Asia. They had withheld troops, failed to provide logistical support, and attempted to reassert independence while Genghis Khan was engaged in distant conquests. For a ruler who demanded absolute loyalty, this was not simply a diplomatic failure, it was a personal betrayal. The Tanguts had once submitted to Mongol overlordship and were expected to uphold their obligations as vassals. Their failure to do so during critical moments, especially during the war with the Khwarazmians, was viewed as a grave offense that could not go unpunished. And so, in the year that corresponds roughly to 1226, Genghis Khan launched what would become his final campaign, an unforgiving assault on Western Xia aimed not at subjugation, but at annihilation. Unlike previous expeditions, this campaign carried an air of finality. The Mongol army, led by Genghis Khan himself, advanced with brutal determination. The Tangut Kingdom, already weakened by years of regional instability, was now facing the full force of a united and battle-hardened Mongol war machine. Genghis Khan was accompanied by seasoned generals, including his youngest son Tolui, who had proven himself in prior campaigns and would lead key segments of the army during the offensive. The strategy was total and merciless. Mongol forces swept across Tangut territory, burning towns, seizing fortresses, and slaughtering entire populations that offered resistance. The goal was not simply to defeat an enemy force, but to destroy the very infrastructure of rebellion. Irrigation systems were destroyed, food stores were seized or set ablaze, and surviving populations were relocated or massacred. This was not an exercise in conquest, but a calculated effort to erase Western Xia from the map. As the Mongol forces pushed deeper into Tangut territory, the capital city of Zhongxing once again became the primary target. This time, however, the city would not be offered terms. No tribute could undo the offense, and no surrender would earn mercy. The siege was long and punishing. Mongol engineers, drawing from Chinese and Persian expertise, constructed siege engines and used fire, catapults, and tunneling to weaken the defenses. Inside the city, panic and despair took hold. The Tangut leadership, recognizing that no help would come from outside powers like the Jin Dynasty or the Song to the south, tried in vain to negotiate. But Genghis Khan refused all offers. His mind was made up. Western Xia would be extinguished as a warning to all who might defy the Mongol Empire. At some point during this campaign, most likely during the siege or shortly after, the great Khan fell ill. Accounts differ on the cause. Some suggest he was thrown from his horse during a hunting expedition, sustaining injuries from which he never fully recovered. Others claim illness, fatigue, or even the compounded effects of age and war finally caught up with him. The exact circumstances remain unclear, in part because the Mongols deliberately kept his condition and later his death a closely guarded secret. What is certain is that Genghis Khan did not live to witness the complete fall of Zhongxing. However, before he died, he gave specific orders for the continuation and completion of the campaign. His desire for vengeance was not diminished by illness. He instructed his generals to carry out the eradication of the Tangut Kingdom without hesitation or compromise. His death, which likely occurred in the summer of 1227, was kept hidden from the public and even from many of his troops. The Mongol leadership feared that news of his passing could demoralize the army or embolden enemies. Thus, his body was quietly transported back to Mongolia, while the campaign pressed on under the command of Tolui and other senior generals. Zhongxing eventually fell. Its population was massacred, the royal family was executed, and the city was burned to the ground. The Western Xia kingdom ceased to exist. Its lands were absorbed into the Mongol domain, and its name would fade from the political map of East Asia. The annihilation of the Tanguts served as a terrifying example of what awaited those who broke faith with the Mongols. Back in Mongolia, a select group of loyalists prepared Genghis Khan's burial. According to tradition, the exact location of his tomb was to remain secret. A funeral procession carried his body back to the Khenti Mountains, where it is believed he was buried in an unmarked grave. Legend holds that the escorting party killed anyone they encountered along the route to preserve the secrecy. Some accounts claim that the burial party itself was later killed by another group tasked with concealing the site forever. While these stories may be embellished, they reflect the intense desire to protect the final resting place of a man who had become more than a ruler. He had become the embodiment of Mongol destiny. The passing of Genghis Khan marked the end of an era, but not the end of the empire he created. Thanks to his foresight and administrative reforms, power transitioned smoothly to his chosen successor, Ogodei. His sons and grandsons would go on to expand the Mongol Empire even further, eventually reaching the gates of Vienna, the shores of the Adriatic, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the Islamic heartlands of Baghdad and Damascus. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan is not measured only by conquests. He fundamentally reshaped the world order. He united disparate tribes into a disciplined force, developed systems of governance that blended steppe traditions with Chinese and Persian administrative practices, and opened vast trade networks that linked East and West as never before. His laws, known as the Yasa, helped create a unified legal system across diverse cultures. His promotion of meritocracy allowed individuals of low birth to rise through talent and loyalty. And his respect for religious tolerance set a precedent for many of his successors, allowing the Mongol Empire to govern Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others without sectarian violence. At the same time, his rule brought extraordinary violence and destruction. Cities were burned, populations exterminated, and ancient civilizations disrupted or destroyed. His methods were often brutal, his campaigns unforgiving, and his punishments extreme. The empire he forged was built on both vision and violence, order and terror. The death of Genghis Khan in the year corresponding to 1227 did not bring about the collapse of his empire. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Mongol world, a phase of institutionalization, planned expansion, and further consolidation under the leadership of his sons and heirs. The machinery of conquest that Genghis Khan had built with such precision did not slow. It adapted, grew, and intensified. The transition of power had been carefully arranged during Genghis Khan's later years. Ogodei, his third son by Borta, had been chosen as the next great Khan. Although he had not yet formally ascended the throne at the time of his father's death, the groundwork had already been laid to ensure a peaceful succession. This was no small achievement. In nomadic and tribal societies, transitions of power often provoked infighting, rebellion, or the fragmentation of alliances. But the Mongol state, through a combination of ritual, loyalty, and pragmatism, held together. Ogodei's accession was confirmed at a Kurultai, a traditional Mongol council held near the capital of Karakorum in the Mongolian heartland. Representatives from the various Mongol clans, allied tribes, and subject peoples attended, affirming their allegiance to the new ruler. The Kurultai served not only as a political assembly, but also as a ritual act of unity. It validated Ogodei's authority and made clear that the empire would continue as a centralized power under a single great Khan. Ogodei's first challenge was to maintain internal unity. The vast empire left behind by Genghis Khan stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Caspian and beyond. To govern such an expanse required a delicate balance of autonomy and control. The solution, built on Genghis Khan's earlier plans, was a formal division of the empire into regional appanages, portions of territory allocated to each son or close descendant, who would govern in the name of the great Khan. The division was not arbitrary. It reflected the geographic positioning of each prince's domain, their prior military commands, and their political strengths. Chagatai, the second son, was granted control over Central Asia, including key regions of Transoxiana and parts of what is now Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. His court, based near Al-Malik, became an important administrative and commercial hub. Chagatai was known for his strict adherence to Mongol laws and customs, and maintained a strong commitment to the Yasa, the legal code instituted by his father. Tolui, the youngest son, inherited the Mongolian homeland, the imperial heartland, and acted as steward of the ancestral lands. He did not initially take on an expansionist role, but remained close to the court, offering support and stability. His influence in religious and ceremonial matters helped preserve traditional Mongol culture at a time when the empire was absorbing new ideas and institutions. Yochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son, had died shortly before his father, but his descendants were granted vast western territories that would eventually form the basis of what came to be known as the Golden Horde. This included the steppe north of the Black Sea, much of modern-day Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe. Yochi's son Batu emerged as the dominant figure in this region, and his campaigns would soon push Mongol influence into territories previously untouched by steppe powers. Ogodei, as Great Khan, remained at the center of the imperial system. His capital at Karakorum became the administrative core of the Mongol world. Though still modest in size, it housed foreign envoys, merchant caravans, scribes, engineers, and artisans from across Eurasia. Ogodei continued his father's policy of integrating diverse talents, employing not only Mongols, but also Uyghurs, Chinese, Muslims, and Christians in his bureaucracy. One of Ogodei's earliest and most important initiatives was the expansion and formalization of the Yam, or imperial relay system. This vast network of relay stations, stocked with fresh horses and supplies, allowed couriers to carry messages across thousands of miles with remarkable speed. It enabled centralized governance and allowed the Great Khan to remain informed of developments from Korea to Kiev. The system also served trade caravans and diplomatic missions, further binding the empire together. Ogodei was also tasked with continuing the expansion of the empire. Genghis Khan had left unfinished business, particularly in northern China, where the remnants of the Jin Dynasty still held power. Within a few years of his accession, Ogodei launched a renewed campaign against the Jin. With support from both Mongol generals and allied southern Chinese forces from the Song dynasty, the Jin were gradually overwhelmed. By the early 30s of the 13th century, the Jin capital at Kaifeng fell, and the dynasty was extinguished. Northern China was now fully under Mongol control. This victory marked a critical moment in Mongol history. For the first time, a major sedentary civilization with a sophisticated administrative structure had been fully absorbed into the empire. The Mongols did not simply destroy the Jin state. They incorporated many of its systems, recruited its scholars, and adapted its institutions. This fusion of steppe and Chinese governance would set the stage for later Mongol rule under Kublai Khan in the Yuan dynasty. But Ogodei's ambitions went even further west. He approved new campaigns aimed at Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. Under his leadership, Mongol armies crossed the Ural Mountains, attacked the Volga Bulgars, and moved into Russian territories. These expeditions were led by generals such as Batu and Subutai, and they would culminate in some of the most dramatic military confrontations of the century, including the eventual Battle of Mohi in Hungary. While these campaigns unfolded, Ogodei remained a figure of stability at home. Unlike his father, who had been a warrior chieftain first and foremost, Ogodei leaned into the role of administrator and ruler. He funded construction projects, including palaces, temples, and public buildings. He supported the arts, welcomed foreign visitors, and encouraged commerce across the empire. Caravans arose, bridges and marketplaces sprang up along the Silk Road, linking cities from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Yet not all was harmonious. Tensions persisted between the various branches of the imperial family. The Chagataids often clashed with the Toluid line over matters of succession, law, and religious tolerance. The Golden Horde, under Batu, operated with considerable autonomy in the west. Though all acknowledged the supremacy of the Great Khan, the unity of the empire increasingly relied on political negotiation and shared interest rather than absolute obedience. Even so, Ogodei managed to preserve the core ideals of his father's rule: meritocracy, religious tolerance, and the supremacy of Mongol law. He hosted Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans at court. He consulted with advisors of diverse backgrounds and maintained a remarkable openness to foreign ideas. The Mongol Empire under his leadership became not just a military juggernaut, but a cosmopolitan center of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. In this period, the legacy of Genghis Khan took institutional form. What had begun as a personal mission to unify the Mongol tribes had become a global system, a Eurasian order governed from the steppes of Mongolia. His descendants now held dominion over lands that no previous empire had connected so completely, and they did so through a blend of conquest, adaptation, and visionary governance. With Ogodei Khan firmly established as the ruler of the Mongol Empire, The dream that Genghis Khan had forged on the windswept steppe was no longer confined to the limits of his own lifetime. The infrastructure, administrative systems, and succession plans he had designed enabled his descendants to carry forward the work of conquest and governance. The Mongol Empire did not stall after his death. It surged forward, reaching new heights under the leadership of his sons and grandsons. One of the first and most significant expansions after Genghis Khan's death occurred in northern China. Although the Jin Dynasty had been weakened during Genghis Khan's campaigns, remnants of its military and bureaucracy continued to resist from strongholds in the Yellow River Basin. Ogodei Khan launched a renewed offensive in collaboration with Song Dynasty forces to the south, who saw the Jin as a common enemy. The Mongols, supported by Chinese defectors and engineers, laid siege to Jin fortresses using advanced siege technology that included counterweight trebuchets and incendiary weapons. The campaign culminated in the capture of Kaifeng, the Jin capital, marking the final extinction of the dynasty. Northern China, with its rich agricultural lands, bustling cities, and sophisticated administrative systems, was absorbed into the Mongol Empire. In doing so, the Mongols gained not only territory, but a vast array of skilled bureaucrats, artisans, and scholars. The empire began to reflect a fusion of steppe and sedentary systems, mobile military command on one hand and bureaucratic urban administration on the other. At the same time, the Mongols expanded aggressively into Central and Western Asia. Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan, led devastating campaigns through Persia, targeting the remnants of the Khwarazmian world and expanding Mongol authority into regions that had once belonged to the Abbasid Caliphate's broader sphere. These invasions destroyed not only cities, but also long-standing political structures. In many cases, entire regions were reduced to rubble and repopulated or restructured under Mongol supervision. In the west, the most dramatic expansion came under Batu Khan, the son of Jochi. Operating as the supreme commander of the Golden Horde, Batu led one of the most ambitious military campaigns in Mongol history, an invasion of Eastern Europe. Guided by the legendary General Subutai, Mongol armies crossed the Ural Mountains and swept into the principalities of Kievan Rus'. They laid waste to cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and eventually Kiev, the spiritual and cultural heart of the Eastern Slavs. The siege of Kiev in the early 30s of the 13th century marked a major turning point in European history. Once a thriving metropolis with strong defensive walls and a population steeped in Orthodox Christianity, Kiev was reduced to ashes. Survivors were few, churches were looted, nobles were executed, and the city was nearly depopulated. The Mongols had announced their presence in Europe with devastating clarity. From the shattered Rus' lands, the Mongol armies turned south and west. They crossed into Hungary and Poland, encountering larger and more organized forces than in the fragmented principalities of the steppe. In Hungary, they faced the army of King Bela IV, while in Poland, they battled a coalition of German, Polish, and Bohemian knights. At the Battle of Mohi, in the heart of Hungary, Mongol tactical brilliance was once again on full display. Subutai orchestrated a complex maneuver involving diversionary attacks, encirclement, and a sudden bridge assault. The result was catastrophic for the European defenders. The Hungarian army was annihilated, and the Mongols advanced further into the Danube basin. Simultaneously, a separate Mongol force destroyed a coalition army at the Battle of Legnica in Poland, where Duke Henry II of Silesia was killed in action. Yet, just as Europe braced for complete collapse under Mongol invasion, the momentum abruptly halted. Word arrived that Ogodei Khan had died back in Mongolia. In accordance with Mongol custom, all royal princes were required to return home for the Kurultai that would decide the next great Khan. Batu withdrew from Central Europe, not out of weakness, but to fulfill the sacred obligations of the imperial order. The continent had been spared total conquest by the timing of a death, not by military resistance. While the European campaign was put on hold, Mongol expansion continued elsewhere. In the east, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai began to turn his attention toward southern China, where the Song dynasty still ruled from its capital at Hangzhou. Unlike the Jin, the Song dynasty governed a more populous and economically vibrant region, with advanced infrastructure, naval power, and strong urban centers. The conquest of the Song would prove far more difficult and drawn out. Kublai, however, approached the challenge with vision. He not only engaged in military campaigns, but also studied Chinese governance and Confucian principles. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors and began to integrate Han administrative practices into his governing style. Though not yet emperor, Kublai's approach foreshadowed the later establishment of the Yuan dynasty, which would rule all of China under Mongol authority. Elsewhere in the Islamic world, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Hulagu, prepared for a campaign that would shock the entire Middle East. Under orders from the Mongol court, he advanced through Persia and toward Mesopotamia, aiming to bring the fragmented Muslim powers into submission. His target would be the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, once the intellectual and spiritual center of the Islamic world. In tandem with these campaigns, the Mongol state continued to evolve. Trade routes across Eurasia flourished under Mongol protection. The Silk Road, which had suffered from instability in earlier centuries, became a highway of goods, ideas, and travelers. Merchants from Venice, scholars from Persia, missionaries from Europe, and craftsmen from China could now traverse thousands of miles under a relatively unified imperial order. This unprecedented connectivity became known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Coinage systems were standardized across regions, weights and measures were calibrated, and caravanserais, resting points for traders, were built at regular intervals. The Yam courier network functioned as a lifeline for the empire, enabling rapid communication from Korea to the Caspian Sea. Religious tolerance, one of Genghis Khan's core principles, remained official policy. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans lived under the protection of Mongol law, though occasional local tensions did arise. Yet this vastness brought new challenges. As the empire expanded across multiple time zones, climates, and cultures, the authority of the Great Khan in Karakoram began to feel increasingly symbolic. Regional leaders such as Batu in the west, Hulagu in the southwest, and Kublai in the east acted with increasing independence. The empire was still united in theory, but in practice, it had begun to function as a collection of powerful khanates with shared heritage but distinct agendas. Still, in this period, the Mongol Empire reached its geographical and cultural peak. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, linking civilizations that had previously been separated by deserts, mountains, and political divisions. And it was all made possible by the foundational work of Genghis Khan and the continuation of his vision by sons and grandsons who understood both the sword and the system. By the middle decades of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stood as the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known. It stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the banks of the Danube River, encompassing vast deserts, forested steppes, snow-covered mountains, and fertile river valleys. The descendants of Genghis Khan ruled over an unprecedented range of cultures, languages, and faiths. And yet, beneath the surface of this immense and interconnected realm, the seeds of fragmentation had already begun to sprout. The system of shared rule established by Genghis Khan, where his descendants each governed parts of the empire while pledging allegiance to the Great Khan, had worked while there was a strong central figure in power. Ogodei Khan, Genghis Khan's chosen successor, had managed to maintain unity during his reign, but following his death in the early 30s of the 13th century, a power vacuum emerged. And in a system so vast and distributed, power vacuums invited rivalry. The struggle for succession after Ogodei's death became the first real test of imperial cohesion. Although Guyuk, the son of Ogodei, was eventually elected as Great Khan, his short reign was marked by increasing tension with other branches of the family, particularly the Tuluid and Yochid lines. Guyuk's sudden death further complicated matters, and it was during this period of instability that Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through Tolui, rose to power with the support of his mother Sorghaghtani and his brother Kublai. Mongol's reign brought a temporary return to central authority. A capable and pragmatic ruler, he expanded the empire's reach, particularly in the Middle East, where his brother Hulagu led a massive campaign that would eventually destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. However, Mongol's death during the campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China reignited the unresolved issue of succession, this time with even greater consequences. Two powerful contenders emerged: Kublai, who had been governing northern China and building his power base there, and Arik Boka, another brother based in the traditional Mongolian heartland. What followed was a civil war between East and West, between the sedentary vision of empire that Kublai represented and the steppe-based traditionalism of Arik Boka. Kublai ultimately emerged victorious, but at great cost. His decision to declare himself Emperor of China and founder of the Yuan dynasty in the late 60s of the 13th century marked a pivotal moment. While he still claimed the title of Great Khan, many in the western parts of the empire no longer recognized his authority. The symbolic unity of the Mongol Empire was broken. In its place, four major successor states emerged, each ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants. The first of these was the Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai Khan and his successors. The Yuan dynasty represented a hybrid model of Mongol and Chinese rule. While maintaining many Mongol customs, it also adopted Confucian bureaucracy, Chinese court rituals, and urban administrative practices. Kublai transformed Beijing into his imperial capital and promoted commerce, infrastructure, and religious tolerance. Yet his rule faced ongoing resistance from southern Chinese loyalists and struggled to fully integrate the vast Han population into the imperial framework. To the west, the Chagatai Khanate governed much of Central Asia, centered around Transoxiana. Initially loyal to the Great Khan, the Chagatai rulers eventually asserted their independence. Their domain became a key link in the Silk Road network, where Persian, Turkic, and Mongol cultures mingled. Over time, the Chagatai Khanate would evolve into a Muslim state, with rulers and elites gradually adopting Islam, shifting the cultural landscape of Central Asia. Further west still, the Ilkhanate emerged in Persia under the leadership of Hulagu and his descendants. The Ilkhanate governed a diverse and sophisticated region that included Persians, Kurds, Arabs, and Armenians. While initially Buddhist or shamanist, the Ilkhanate rulers eventually converted to Islam. This transformation helped stabilize their rule and allowed them to integrate more fully with the local populations. The Ilkhanate contributed greatly to Persian art, architecture, and science, even as it remained politically fragile and vulnerable to succession crises. The fourth major successor state was the Golden Horde, based in the steppe north of the Black Sea and extending into the Russian principalities. Governed by the descendants of Yochi, especially Batu and his successors, the Golden Horde retained more of the steppe nomadic character than the other Khanates. Its rulers imposed tribute on Russian cities and towns, including Novgorod and Moscow, shaping the development of Eastern Europe for generations. Islam also became a defining feature of the Golden Horde, especially under Khan Uzbeg, who officially adopted the faith and promoted it across his domain. Each of these Khanates operated independently, and while they occasionally cooperated or recognized symbolic links to a broader Mongol identity, they increasingly pursued their own policies, fought one another, and interacted with neighboring powers as separate states. The dream of a united empire was no longer politically viable. Despite this political fragmentation, the cultural and economic legacy of the Mongol Empire endured. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and security across Eurasia, continued to facilitate trade, travel, and cultural exchange. Goods from China reached markets in Europe. Persian scholars traveled to courts in Central Asia. Christian missionaries and Muslim traders crossed the steppes with relative ease. The Mongols had also contributed to the spread of knowledge. Papermaking, printing, medical texts, astronomical charts, and mathematical theories flowed from one end of Eurasia to the other. The Mongol courts often acted as centers of translation and learning, where texts were rendered into multiple languages, and scholars of different faiths were encouraged to debate and collaborate. Religious tolerance remained a notable feature of Mongol governance. Unlike many contemporary empires that imposed a state religion, Mongol rulers often allowed subject peoples to practice their faiths freely, so long as they paid taxes and remained loyal. This pluralism allowed the coexistence of Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and traditional steppe beliefs across the empire's many regions. Even as the empire fractured, Genghis Khan's descendants continued to rule vast and influential realms. Their lineage remained central to political legitimacy for centuries. In Russia, the Mongol legacy shaped the rise of Muscovy. In Persia, the Ilkhanate influence lived on through cultural and administrative innovations. In China, the Yuan dynasty introduced lasting changes to governance, despite its eventual fall and replacement by the Ming. Moreover, the genetic and demographic legacy of the Mongol conquests has continued to draw scholarly attention. Modern genetic studies have revealed that a large percentage of men in regions once ruled by the Mongols share a common Y chromosome lineage, believed to trace back to Genghis Khan himself. This is less a myth than a reflection of the empire's massive demographic impact. Whether through intermarriage, elite dominance, or assimilation, the Mongol rulers left a deep biological imprint on the populations they governed. In the grand arc of world history, the Mongol Empire occupies a unique space. It was both destructive and generative, violent and unifying, foreign and familiar. It erased old powers while creating new ones. It spread terror, but also trade. And at its heart was the vision of one man, born into poverty on the edge of the world, who imagined that the scattered tribes of the steppe could be forged into a force that would change the fate of continents. Centuries have passed since Genghis Khan rode across the steppe at the head of an army that would reshape continents. His empire has long vanished, the borders redrawn, the cities rebuilt or renamed. Yet his legacy remains, embedded not only in the physical traces of conquest, but in the memories, myths, and narratives that have survived through generations. Few figures in world history have left a more complex or far-reaching imprint. In the regions once ruled by the Mongols, the memory of Genghis Khan has evolved in distinct and sometimes conflicting ways. In Mongolia itself, he is venerated as the founder of the nation, a cultural hero, a symbol of unity, and a father of the people. For many Mongols, Genghis Khan is more than a historical figure. He is an enduring presence in the national identity. During the socialist era of the 20th century, when Mongolia came under strong Soviet influence, the public celebration of Genghis Khan was suppressed. Soviet ideology, which emphasized proletarian internationalism and class struggle, viewed the glorification of feudal conquerors with suspicion. His image was downplayed and his legacy confined to the margins of official history. But with the fall of communism in the early 1990s, Genghis Khan returned to the forefront of Mongolian national consciousness. Today, his name graces airports, universities, banks, and even brands of vodka. A colossal statue of the Khan on horseback towers over the plains east of Ulaanbaatar, symbolizing his central place in modern Mongolian pride. School children study his life in textbooks, and his birthday is marked with national ceremonies. To Mongolians, he represents not only historical glory, but resilience, identity, and cultural continuity in a world that has often tried to erase or marginalize smaller nations. Beyond Mongolia, however, the perception of Genghis Khan is more ambiguous. In many parts of the Islamic world, his name still evokes memories of destruction, particularly the sack of Baghdad in the mid-13th century and the devastation of Khwarazmian cities. The Mongol invasion shattered the political and cultural heart of medieval Islam, toppling dynasties and disrupting centuries of intellectual and religious life. In parts of China, his legacy has also been contested. On one hand, Genghis Khan is acknowledged as a major historical figure whose dynasty, the Yuan, ruled all of China. His descendants adopted many aspects of Chinese governance and contributed to the evolution of imperial administration. On the other hand, some Chinese historical narratives have portrayed him as a foreign conqueror who ruled through violence and disruption. Despite these divergent views, modern Chinese scholarship has increasingly sought to reassess Genghis Khan in a broader Eurasian context, focusing on the exchange of knowledge, technology, and commerce under Mongol rule. Museums and historical studies in China now highlight the cultural and diplomatic achievements of the Mongol period alongside its military campaigns. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the Mongol legacy is similarly complicated. The Mongol yoke, as it was traditionally called in Russian historiography, referred to the 2 centuries of tribute and subjugation imposed by the Golden Horde. For generations, this era was viewed as a time of stagnation and isolation. However, more recent studies have challenged this view, emphasizing the administrative innovations, military organization, and cross-cultural influences that took root under Mongol rule. Western Europe, which largely escaped the direct reach of Mongol conquest, viewed Genghis Khan through the lens of fascination and fear. Medieval chroniclers, often relying on second-hand or exaggerated reports, described him as a scourge sent by God to punish Christian kingdoms for their sins. Over time, this image gave way to more nuanced understandings. Enlightenment thinkers saw in Genghis Khan both the example of a despot and the possibility of a civilizing force in regions previously unknown to Europe. In the modern West, the figure of Genghis Khan continues to inspire debate. Historians and writers have portrayed him variously as a brilliant strategist, a ruthless tyrant, a visionary empire builder, and a cultural bridge between civilizations. In popular culture, he has appeared in films, novels, video games, and documentaries, often reflecting the dual nature of his legacy, admired for his achievements, feared for his methods. One of the most intriguing aspects of Genghis Khan's modern influence lies in the field of genetics. In the early 21st century, a team of geneticists studying Y chromosome variation across Eurasia made a startling discovery: a single male lineage originating roughly in the region of Mongolia and dating back around 8 centuries was found in a significant percentage of men from the Pacific to the Caspian. The researchers concluded that this lineage likely originated from Genghis Khan, or a close male ancestor, given the timeline, location, and spread. While estimates vary, some researchers suggest that as many as 16 million men alive today may be direct paternal line descendants of Genghis Khan. This does not imply that he fathered all these lines personally, but rather that his lineage, through his sons, grandsons, and other male descendants, enjoyed social and reproductive advantages that allowed their genes to dominate across generations. This genetic legacy is more than a curiosity. It reflects the extraordinary demographic and social impact of the Mongol elite in the regions they conquered. Through marriage alliances, conquests, political appointments, and elite reproduction, the descendants of Genghis Khan became embedded in the aristocracy and ruling classes of numerous societies across Asia and Eastern Europe. In academia, the study of Genghis Khan continues to evolve. Scholars have moved beyond the older dichotomies of barbarian versus civilized, destroyer versus builder, to examine the more subtle and interconnected elements of his empire. His use of meritocratic recruitment, religious tolerance, cross-cultural exchange, and codified law has drawn increasing attention. His leadership model, based on loyalty, discipline, and decentralized command, has even been studied in military academies and business schools. In international relations, Genghis Khan's empire offers both warnings and lessons. It shows how rapid expansion without administrative integration can lead to fragmentation. It demonstrates how strategic tolerance can stabilize a multi-ethnic empire, but also how excessive reliance on personal loyalty can generate succession crises. The Mongol experience continues to inform discussions on empire, globalization, and the management of diversity. Ultimately, Genghis Khan's influence endures because he represents a convergence of forces: nomadic energy, visionary leadership, ruthless pragmatism, and historical consequence. He was a man of his time, shaped by the brutal realities of the 12th century steppe. But he also shaped his time, bending the world to a new trajectory that would echo for centuries. He reminds us that history is rarely neat. It does not divide its figures cleanly into heroes or villains. It leaves behind legacies that are vast, complex, and contested. Genghis Khan was a unifier and a destroyer, a lawgiver and a warlord, a nation builder, and a name that still evokes awe and unease. When Temüjin was born on the banks of the Onan River in the year that corresponds to the early 1160s, few could have imagined that this child, born into a minor Mongol clan, orphaned, cast out, and nearly forgotten, would grow to become one of the most consequential figures in human history. His rise, against unimaginable odds, from the edge of survival to the pinnacle of global power, marks one of the most extraordinary journeys in the historical record. Throughout his life, Temüjin's actions were shaped by the unforgiving realities of the steppe. He lived in a world without written law, where tribal loyalty was fragile and power belonged to those who could seize and hold it. In this world, he forged something unprecedented, not merely an army, not simply an empire, but a new form of rule that challenged the norms of his age. His ascent began not with victory, but with loss. After the death of his father, his family was abandoned by their tribe and left to fend for themselves. The years that followed, marked by hunger, hardship, and betrayal, instilled in him a fierce determination and a deep understanding of loyalty and leadership. These formative experiences became the crucible in which his vision for the future was forged. Temüjin's genius lay not in sheer brutality, but in his ability to think beyond the conventions of his time. He reimagined Mongol society by promoting people not based on tribal aristocracy, but on ability and loyalty. He created bonds of trust that transcended clan lines, and in doing so, he broke the cycle of infighting that had long plagued the steppe. His military brilliance was matched by his political foresight. He reorganized the Mongol tribes into a coherent state, established clear codes of law, and developed systems of communication and administration that allowed his authority to extend across vast and diverse territories. He was not content to raid and retreat. He aimed to govern. By the time of his formal proclamation as Genghis Khan at the Great Kurultai in the year 1206, he had already unified the Mongol tribes. But his ambitions did not end there. He launched military campaigns that expanded his empire in every direction. From the defeat of the Western Xia and the Jin Dynasty in China to the annihilation of the Khwarazmian Empire in Central Asia, Genghis Khan proved time and again that he was not only a master of mobility and tactics, but of psychological warfare and diplomacy. His strategies combined traditional steppe warfare with innovations borrowed and adapted from his enemies. He integrated engineers, artisans, and scholars from conquered lands into his service. He respected diverse religions, welcomed foreign knowledge, and demanded loyalty above all. His model of rule was not ideological, it was practical, adaptable, and effective. The Mongol army, under his leadership, became the most feared force of its time. It was fast, organized, and devastatingly efficient. But it was also a tool of statecraft. Genghis Khan used fear to compel submission, but he also used justice and fairness to bind people to his rule. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Those that surrendered often found themselves integrated into the empire with minimal disruption. And yet, he was not immune to cruelty. The scale of destruction in his campaigns remains staggering. Cities were leveled, populations massacred, and cultural centers erased. His punishments for betrayal were severe. But even his harshest critics must acknowledge the discipline, order, and stability he brought to once chaotic regions. By the time of his death in the year 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But more than territory, Genghis Khan had created something more durable, a system of rule that could survive his passing. His sons and grandsons would go on to conquer more land, rule vast kingdoms, and spread Mongol influence even further. His dynasty endured for generations and left deep marks on China, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. And yet, the man himself remains somewhat elusive. No verified portrait survives. His burial place remains a mystery, hidden in accordance with Mongol customs and guarded by secrecy and legend. What we know of him comes from chronicles written by those who admired him, feared him, or sought to understand him. In these accounts, he emerges as both visionary and destroyer, both human and larger than life. In historical memory, Genghis Khan defies simple categorization. He was at once a unifier and a conqueror, a father of a nation and the terror of civilizations, a builder of laws and a breaker of cities. His story is one of ambition unbounded, of a single life bending the arc of history through will, skill, and an unrelenting drive for greatness. Today, we live in a world still shaped by his legacy. Trade networks that he once secured evolved into global routes of commerce. Empires he broke gave rise to new political orders. His descendants mingled with royal lines, influenced art and administration, and reshaped religious and ethnic landscapes across continents. Modern technology has even traced his genetic legacy, identifying millions of people who may carry the DNA of his dynasty. His story is told in classrooms, studied by historians, and invoked in political and cultural debates from Mongolia to the Middle East and beyond. He is claimed by many, feared by some, admired by others, but none deny his significance. And so, the story of Genghis Khan, born Temüjin, forged by hardship, lifted by vision, ends not with his death, but with the world he left behind. A world altered at its core by a man who began with nothing and changed everything. From the wind-blown steppes of Mongolia to the ancient cities of Samarkand, Baghdad, and Beijing, his shadow still lingers. His empire may have crumbled, but his influence endures. And in the long story of humanity, his name remains among the few that history cannot forget.